May 1945. Schliersee, Bavaria. The war in Europe has been over for less than 3 weeks. American troops occupy what was once the heartland of the Third Reich. Small Bavarian villages that never saw combat now house occupation forces trying to make sense of a shattered nation. In the crystal-clear waters of Schliersee, a picturesque alpine lake that looks like something from a postcard, U.S. Navy divers descend into the cold depths. Their mission is grim but necessary: recover the body of an American soldier who drowned in the chaos of the early occupation. A young man who survived the war only to die in its immediate aftermath. The divers work methodically, searching the lake bottom 30 feet below the surface. The water is clear but the depths are murky, filled with silt and debris. Then a diver's hand touches something. Something that shouldn't be there. A box. Military construction. Waterproof seal. Heavy, far too heavy to be empty. The diver surfaces and reports the discovery. An officer makes a decision: keep searching. Systematically. Cover every square foot of that lake bottom. Over the next several weeks, box after box emerges from the depths. 29 waterproof containers in total. Each one sealed. Each one carefully hidden. When they finally pry them open, the intelligence officers standing on the shoreline realize they've stumbled onto something extraordinary. 4 tons of documents. 300,000 pages. The complete archives of the German High Command Cipher Bureau, every code they'd broken, every secret they'd stolen, every cryptographic technique they'd mastered during 6 years of total war. The Germans had tried to hide their most valuable intelligence from the advancing Allies. They'd failed. And what the Americans found at the bottom of that Bavarian lake would help reshape the secret war that was just beginning, the Cold War against the Soviet Union. This is the story of the greatest intelligence treasure hunt in history. A story of desperate German officers trying to preserve their life's work. Of American codebreakers racing against time in the advancing Red Army. Of secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. This is the story of TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee, and the underwater archive that changed everything. To understand why 29 boxes at the bottom of a lake mattered so much, you need to understand the war that most people never knew was being fought. World War II wasn't just won on battlefields. It was won in the minds of mathematicians working in converted country estates, linguists poring over intercepted messages in windowless rooms, engineers building machines that could think faster than any human mind. In Britain there was Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside that became the nerve center of Allied code breaking. This is where Alan Turing and his team broke the German Enigma machine, reading Hitler's supposedly unbreakable codes and changing the course of the war. In America there was Arlington Hall, a former girls' school in Virginia, hastily converted into a cryptanalysis center where civilian professors and military officers worked side by side to crack Japanese diplomatic codes and increasingly Soviet communications. These weren't traditional military installations. They were filled with chess champions, linguists who could speak 5 languages, mathematicians who thought in equations the way normal people think in words. Many had been teaching at universities just months before. Now they were fighting a war that had to remain completely secret. The reason was simple: the moment your enemy knows you've broken their codes, they change them. All that painstaking work, months or years of analysis, brilliant breakthroughs, hard-won victories, becomes worthless overnight. The Germans, it turned out, had been masters of this invisible war. While the Allies were breaking German codes, German cryptanalysts had been doing the same thing to Allied communications. And nowhere had German signals intelligence been more active, or more successful, than on the Eastern Front. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, invading the Soviet Union with 3 million men, the German military machine brought more than just tanks and infantry. They brought sophisticated signals intelligence units, mobile listening posts, cryptanalysis teams that had been preparing for this moment for years. The Germans had been intercepting Soviet communications since before the war even started. They had specialist units, Funkaufklärung, radio reconnaissance, whose sole job was to capture Soviet radio signals, record them, analyze them, and break them. And they succeeded. Far more than most historians realized for decades after the war. By 1945, the German Signals Intelligence Services had accumulated 6 years of knowledge about Soviet cryptography. 6 years of successful code breaking. 6 years of detailed technical analysis. All of it carefully documented. all of it filed away in archives that represented the accumulated cryptographic intelligence of the entire German military apparatus. And in the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, all of that priceless intelligence was in danger of being lost forever. Germany in April and May 1945. The Soviet Red Army advancing from the east. American and British forces pushing in from the west. The Nazi government in its death throes, with Hitler dead in his bunker and the military command structure disintegrating. Across Germany, officials were burning documents by the truckload. Entire archives going up in smoke. Cipher machines being smashed. Codebooks being shredded. Anything that might be valuable to the Allies was being systematically destroyed. The order had come from the highest levels. Leave nothing for the enemy. Every secret, every technique, every piece of intelligence was to be eliminated. But some German intelligence officers couldn't bring themselves to do it. These men had spent years, in some cases, their entire adult lives, building Germany's signals intelligence capabilities. They'd broken codes that their superiors said were unbreakable. They'd read the enemy's most secret communications. They'd provided intelligence that saved German lives and shaped military operations. And now they were being told to burn it all. To destroy years of painstaking work as if it had never existed. Some refused. Or at least they found a middle path. They would hide their archives. Bury them. Sink them. Wait out the chaos. And perhaps, if they survived, use them as bargaining chips with whichever occupying power captured them. In Bavaria, someone in the German High Command Cipher Bureau, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht's cryptographic section, made exactly that decision. 29 waterproof military storage containers. Built to protect sensitive equipment from the elements. Perfect for submerging in a lake. 4 tons of documents carefully packed inside. Every major cryptanalytic success. Every captured codebook. Every technical analysis of enemy cipher systems. The crown jewels of German signals intelligence. Under cover of darkness, probably in the final chaotic weeks before the American arrival, German personnel loaded the containers onto trucks. They drove to Schliersee. And they consigned their nation's cryptographic secrets to the depths of an alpine lake. The water would preserve them. The remote location would keep them hidden. And when the time was right, perhaps they could be recovered. It was a good plan. It almost worked. While German intelligence officers were hiding their archives, Allied codebreakers were already looking ahead to the next challenge. The war in Europe wasn't even over yet, but the signs were everywhere. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was fracturing. Stalin was imposing communist governments across Eastern Europe. Churchill was warning privately about an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. And American intelligence analysts were asking an uncomfortable question. What do we really know about Soviet capabilities? Soviet intentions? Soviet secrets? The answer was not nearly enough. Since 1943, a small team at Arlington Hall in Virginia had been working on Soviet diplomatic communications. The effort was led by men like Cecil Phillips, a young analyst who'd made a crucial discovery. The Soviets, despite using theoretically unbreakable one-time pad encryption, had made mistakes. They'd reused some encryption keys, creating vulnerabilities that skilled cryptanalysts might exploit. But progress was agonizingly slow. By early 1945, they'd barely scratched the surface. They'd recovered some encryption key, identified a handful of code groups, but hadn't read a single complete Soviet message. They needed more information, more context, more pieces to fit into the puzzle. They needed, in short, exactly what the Germans had spent 6 years acquiring. If the Allies could get their hands on German intelligence about Soviet cryptography, the methods, the vulnerabilities, the successes, it would be like gaining years of research in an instant. But first they had to find it, before the Germans destroyed it. And before the advancing Soviet forces captured it themselves. That's where TICOM came in. A full year before Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence planners were already thinking ahead. They knew that when the Third Reich collapsed, there would be a brief, chaotic window of opportunity. A moment when German records might be captured, equipment seized, personnel interrogated, before everything was destroyed or disappeared into Soviet-occupied territory. The plan they developed was audacious. Send small teams of cryptologic experts in uniform, advancing with Allied troops through Germany. Their mission: find German signals intelligence units, secure their equipment and records, and capture the personnel who'd worked on breaking Allied and Soviet codes. They called it TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee. The name was deliberately vague, designed to hide the true purpose from anyone who didn't need to know. The operation was approved at the highest levels. General George Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, endorsed the plan in August 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, agreed to provide support. The British Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park would coordinate operations. And then came the hard part, finding the right people for the mission. The TICOM teams needed to be a unique combination of skills. They needed cryptanalytic expertise to recognize valuable material when they found it. They needed to be in uniform with military authority to operate in combat zones. They needed language skills to interrogate German prisoners. And ideally, they needed enough military bearing to avoid getting themselves killed in the chaos of a collapsing nation. That last requirement was optimistic. The men assigned to TICOM teams were about as unmilitary as you could imagine while still wearing a uniform. Take Art Levinson, a math major from City College of New York. Jewish kid from Brooklyn who'd been called up and sent to infantry training at Fort Dix. He'd managed, barely, to extract himself from that fate and get assigned to Arlington Hall, then to the Signal Corps contingent working with the British at Bletchley Park on the Enigma project. Levinson remembered the reaction of the regular Army sergeant in their unit, a career soldier who couldn't get over this outfit, whose members could barely manage to appear with their uniforms on correctly. When the sergeant heard that Levinson and a few dozen others were going to Germany in April 1945, he said, "Boy, the war must really be over if they're sending you guys." Or Howard Campagny, a Navy lieutenant commander who'd been a mathematics professor at the University of Minnesota. Brilliant mind. Could reconstruct cipher systems in his head. Had zero interest in military protocol and even less ability to navigate Army bureaucracy. Or John Tester, the British major who led TICOM Team 1. He'd run one of the two groups at Bletchley that worked on breaking German teleprinter encryption, systems the British called FISH. Tester knew more about cryptanalysis than most generals knew about warfare. But commanding troops in occupied Germany? That was going to be interesting. These were the men who would hunt for Nazi Germany's cryptographic secrets. Mathematicians and linguists pretending to be soldiers, driving jeeps through a war zone, trying to find intelligence treasures before they were destroyed or captured by the Soviets. It was going to be an adventure. TICOM Team 1 entered Germany in April 1945, just as the Nazi regime was entering its final collapse. Imagine the scene. Young American and British cryptanalysts, most of whom had spent the war in quiet offices solving abstract mathematical puzzles, suddenly thrust into a landscape of destruction. Burned-out tanks littering the roads. Refugees streaming westward, desperate to escape the advancing Red Army. German soldiers surrendering by the thousands. Cities reduced to rubble. And somewhere in all that chaos, they were supposed to find specific German signals intelligence units, identify valuable personnel, and secure cryptographic materials before they vanished forever. They had almost no leads to work with. No comprehensive list of German cryptanalytic facilities. No organizational charts showing where signals intelligence units might be located. Just fragments of information from prisoner interrogations and a lot of educated guessing. Their method was simple. Show up at the headquarters of an American Army unit and ask if anyone knew about German signal stations in the area, or whether they were holding any prisoners who'd worked in communications intelligence. A lot of leads went nowhere. The occupation forces, focused on basic security and managing millions of prisoners and refugees, had mostly just thrown guards around whatever German installations they found without bothering to learn what they did. Campagny remembered following up one report about a possible German research facility high in the Tyrolean mountains. He drove up there and found a lone GI standing guard at the door. Campagny asked him what the Germans had used the facility for. "Ah, them Krauts," the soldier replied with a dismissive wave. "They built all kinds of shit. Not exactly helpful intelligence. But sometimes they got lucky." TICOM Team 3 stumbled onto their treasure in a castle at Naumburg, near the city of Leipzig. It was pure chance. They'd been following vague rumors about a German Foreign Office cryptologic unit that had retreated south as the Red Army advanced. Someone mentioned Naumburg. The team decided to check it out. What they found exceeded their wildest hopes. A complete German Foreign Office signals intelligence unit, personnel and all, holed up in a medieval castle like something from a fairy tale. There was just one problem. Naumburg was in territory that had been designated as part of the Soviet occupation zone under the agreements the Allies had worked out for dividing Germany. Soviet forces were literally moving in to take control. The Tikum team had days, maybe hours, before Russian troops arrived. The head of the team walked into that castle, found the German cryptographers, and delivered a simple message: "If you destroy any of your files, you will be shot." Then he left, letting that threat sink in. He returned a few days later with his full team, trucks, and packing materials. 300,000 pages of documents. 170 steel file cases. Everything from codebooks to technical analyses to operational reports. The accumulated intelligence of German cryptanalysis against Allied and Soviet communications. And they spirited it all out under the noses of advancing Soviet forces, racing westward before the Russians realized what was happening. Hidden in those Naumburg files, though no one would realize it for more than a decade, were actual Soviet codebooks. The Germans had recovered them from a burning pile when the Soviets hastily evacuated their consulate in northern Finland in 1941, during the confused fighting when Finland was both fighting the Soviets and maintaining an uneasy quasi-alliance with Germany. The Finns had passed the captured Soviet materials to their German allies. And German cryptanalysts had used them to read Soviet diplomatic traffic for years. Now those codebooks were in Allied hands. They would eventually help crack Soviet messages that had been sitting in files at Arlington Hall for years, considered unbreakable. But that discovery was still in the future. In May 1945, the Tikum teams were still hunting. On May 21, 1945, Howard Campagny received a tip that changed everything. The U.S. 7th Army was holding thousands of German prisoners at a POW camp in Bad Aibling, between Munich and Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. One prisoner had told the camp authorities that he'd worked on intercepting and breaking Soviet radio teleprinter traffic in a specialized unit. Campagny hastened over to interview the man. His name was Dietrich Suschjauk. An Unteroffizier, basically a sergeant. Young, nervous but eager to cooperate. He told Campagny that he and 19 other men from his unit, all now prisoners in the same camp, had buried their equipment and documents at a barracks in nearby Rosenheim. The next day, Campagny returned with a truck, collected all 20 prisoners, drove them to Rosenheim and set them to work digging up their cache. 8 tons of material emerged from the ground. Cryptanalytic records, technical equipment, radio receivers, teleprinter machines, and something particularly valuable, sophisticated demultiplexing devices that the Germans had built to intercept and separate Soviet radio teleprinter signals. The prisoners were helpful but afraid at first, uncertain what would happen to them. But they quickly warmed up when Campagny showed genuine interest in the technical aspects of their work. These men, all NCOs, viewed themselves not really as soldiers but as specialists, with genuine pride in their work. When Campagny asked technical questions about how their equipment functioned, they eagerly offered to reassemble one of the devices and demonstrate how it worked. By June 5, the equipment was on its way to England by air. By June 29, 6 of the most knowledgeable prisoners arrived at the village of Steeple Clayton, 15 miles from Bletchley Park, where their gear awaited them. By the next evening, they had one of their prize pieces of apparatus assembled and working. One prisoner in particular stood out as exceptionally intelligent and cooperative: Unteroffizier Erich Karenberg. Karenberg's background was fascinating. He'd grown up in Russia, the son of a German manufacturer, and spoke Russian fluently. Before the war, he'd been a concert pianist and lecturer in the history of art and music at Berlin University. Not exactly your typical signals intelligence operative. But Karenberg had a mathematical mind, and from the start, the British experts who interviewed him could tell he was thoroughly conversant in cryptanalytic terminology. He wasn't just a radio operator who'd been trained to follow procedures. He understood the theory. He could explain why certain techniques worked and others didn't. Russian radio callsign procedures. The organization of the Red Army's radio networks. The encryption systems used on Soviet teleprinter traffic. The mistakes Soviet operators made that created vulnerabilities German cryptanalysts could exploit. What Karenberg revealed was gold to the Allied codebreakers who were now trying to do exactly what the Germans had been doing: penetrate Soviet communications. He described how some Soviet traffic was sent in the clear or with minimal encryption, simple scrambling that could be broken with enough depth to work from. There were other messages that used 3-, 4- or 5-letter code groups, evidently enciphered codes. The Germans had solved some of these but concluded others were protected by one-time pads, theoretically unbreakable. But there was also a considerable amount of traffic on two-channel circuits that was being encrypted by an online device, a machine built into the teleprinter system that automatically scrambled messages as they were transmitted. The Germans called this device the bandworm, literally tapeworm, because of how the encrypted messages would scroll out in long, continuous streams. Here's where it got interesting. Kahrenberg reported that Soviet radio operators were often extremely careless in how they handled their encrypted communications. They would frequently give away crucial information during their preliminary unencrypted chat, as they established a connection. Think about it. Before sending an encrypted message, operators on both ends had to coordinate, make sure they were on the right frequency, confirm they could hear each other clearly. This coordination was done in plain language, unencrypted. And Soviet operators, either through carelessness or inadequate training, would sometimes reveal details about the encrypted messages they were about to send. Starting position indicators for their cipher machines. Message numbers. Even hints about content. German listeners, monitoring these preliminary conversations, could identify instances when 2 or more messages were being sent with the same machine settings, creating what cryptanalysts call depths, situations where the same encryption key is used for multiple messages. And depths are the codebreaker's best friend. Even better, the Soviets included standard preambles and addresses within the encrypted portion of their messages. This meant there were highly predictable, stereotyped openings, the same text appearing in message after message, just encrypted differently depending on the key used. If you knew that every message started with something like, "To Moscow headquarters from Field Station 47, you could use that knowledge to attack the encryption. You'd be looking for encrypted text that, when decrypted, would produce that known plaintext. It was a huge vulnerability. Another rich source of exploitable material came from technical failures. Soviet transmitters and receivers would often get out of sync in the middle of a transmission. When that happened, the entire message had to be resent, resulting in large amounts of duplicated plaintext being encrypted, sometimes with different keys, sometimes with the same key. Either way, it was manna from heaven for cryptanalysts. The Germans hadn't fully cracked the Soviet teleprinter encryption system. They hadn't reconstructed the machine's internal workings the way British cryptanalysts at Bletchley had done with German systems. But using operator errors, stereotyped content, and inspired guesswork, German codebreakers had been able to read a significant amount of Soviet military traffic. Messages from Army front headquarters to Moscow about positions and situations. Orders concerning officer postings, transfers, and promotions. Signals intelligence reports. Prisoner interrogation summaries. Logistical information. Nothing that would reveal Soviet strategic planning for major offensives. That traffic was probably on more secure systems. But plenty of operationally valuable intelligence that had helped German commanders on the Eastern Front. And now, all of that knowledge was being transferred to the Allies. The Schliersee discovery. Which brings us back to that alpine lake in Bavaria. The exact date isn't recorded in the declassified documents, but it was sometime in May 1945, in those chaotic weeks right after Germany's surrender. Schliersee is beautiful. Crystal clear water surrounded by mountains. The kind of place where, in peacetime, tourists would come to hike and sail and breathe the mountain air. Small villages dot the shoreline, connected by winding roads that climb into the Alps. In May 1945, it was occupied American territory, and the U.S. Army had more pressing concerns than scenery. An American soldier had drowned. The circumstances aren't entirely clear from the historical record. Probably an accident during the early occupation, when discipline was loose and young men who'd survived years of combat sometimes took unnecessary risks. His unit wanted to recover the body and give him a proper burial. The Army called in professional recovery divers. They descended into the cold water, searching the lake bottom for their fallen comrade. And then one of the divers felt something with his hands. Something that definitely wasn't what they were looking for. A military storage container. Waterproof. Heavy. The kind of thing you'd use for equipment or documents you wanted to protect from the elements. The diver surfaced and reported what he'd found. An officer, we don't know his name but he made a crucial decision, ordered the divers to keep searching. Systematically. Cover every inch of that lake bottom. they brought in more diverse. Army engineers arrived with proper search equipment. And over the next several weeks they pulled up box after box after box. 29 containers in total. Each one sealed. Each one waterproof. Each one containing files, documents, folders, all in German, all marked with various levels of military security classifications. When intelligence officers finally pried open the boxes and started going through the contents, they must have felt like they'd won the lottery. This wasn't random military paperwork. This wasn't supply records or personnel files or the usual administrative flotsam and jetsam that armies generate by the ton. This was the complete archive of the German High Command's Cipher Bureau, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht's cryptographic section. 4 tons of documents. 300,000 pages. The accumulated cryptographic knowledge of the entire German military intelligence apparatus. Every codebook they'd captured or reconstructed. Every analysis of enemy cipher systems, Allied and Soviet. Every technical report on encryption devices. Every piece of intelligence they gathered about enemy communications security. Every successful code-breaking operation. Every vulnerability they discovered and exploited. It was all there, preserved underwater, waiting to be found. And it was all in the American occupation zone, but just barely. Schliersee was only a few miles from territories that had been designated as part of the Soviet occupation zone. The American intelligence officers who'd realized what they'd found knew one thing with absolute certainty. They could not let this material fall into Soviet hands. If the Soviets got their hands on any of that, they'd immediately know their communications had been compromised. They'd change everything, new codebooks, new procedures, new machines. Any hope the Western Allies had of reading Soviet communications would be dead. Worse, the Schliersee documents also contained German analysis of British and American cipher systems. What the Germans had learned about Allied cryptography during the war. Which systems they'd broken, which they'd failed to crack, where the vulnerabilities were. If the Soviets acquired that information, they'd have a roadmap to Allied communications security weaknesses. Weaknesses they could exploit themselves or share with other adversaries. This wasn't just valuable intelligence. This was potentially catastrophic material if it fell into the wrong hands. Soviet forces were moving into their designated occupation zones. Russian troops were already visible in areas not far from Schliersee. The Americans needed to get this material out of Germany, and they needed to do it immediately before anyone, especially the Soviets, realized what had been found. Within days, possibly within hours of the full scope of the discovery becoming clear, the machinery was in motion. 2 C-47 transport planes were diverted to the nearest airfield. Military trucks were commandeered. Armed guards were posted around the facility where the documents were being hastily dried out, catalogued, and prepared for transport. American soldiers working around the clock, carefully packing 4 tons of damp German documents into wooden crates. The documents had been underwater for weeks, sealed in waterproof containers but still moisture damaged. They needed to be handled carefully to prevent further deterioration. Loading the crates onto trucks. Driving them to the airfield under armed escort, watching for any sign that Soviet intelligence might have gotten wind of what was happening. Loading them onto the C-47s. 2 propeller-driven transport planes, workhorses of the war, now carrying perhaps the most valuable intelligence cargo of the entire conflict. And then the planes took off, engines roaring, climbing into the sky, racing westward toward the British Isles. Their destination, RAF Biggin Hill, southeast of London. The same airfield that had been famous during the Battle of Britain, when Spitfire scrambled from its runways to defend against the Luftwaffe. Now it was serving a different purpose, as a secure receiving point for captured German intelligence materials. More trucks were waiting at Biggin Hill. They rushed the entire haul directly to Bletchley Park, where the war's most successful codebreakers were already preparing for their next mission, understanding Soviet communications. At Bletchley Park, the arrival of the Schliersee documents caused what you might call controlled excitement. The war in Europe might have been over, but Bletchley was still fully operational. The brilliant minds who'd spent years breaking German codes, Enigma, Fish, every system the Wehrmacht had devised, now had a new target. And that target was becoming clearer every day, the Soviet Union. The wartime alliance was fracturing visibly. Stalin was imposing communist governments across Eastern Europe. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was still a year away, but the sentiment was already there. American intelligence analysts were filing reports about Soviet intentions that ranged from concerned to alarmed. The cryptanalysts at Bletchley and Arlington Hall needed to understand Soviet communications. And the Schliersee documents were like finding a master's degree worth of knowledge just handed to them. The Germans, it turned out, had been meticulous record keepers. The files contained technical specifications for German cipher machines, not directly relevant to Soviet code breaking, but valuable for understanding German cryptographic thinking and potentially useful for analyzing any captured Soviet equipment that might use similar principles. Detailed reports on German attempts to break Allied codes. This was uncomfortable reading. The documents revealed which Allied systems the Germans had successfully penetrated during the war, which ones had remained secure, and where the vulnerabilities were. Some of it confirmed what Allied security analysts had suspected. Some of it was shocking news. Comprehensive analysis of Soviet cipher systems. This was the crown jewel. Page after page of German technical analysis describing Soviet encryption methods, machine specifications, codebook structures, everything the Germans had learned in 4 years of intensive signals intelligence operations on the Eastern Front. Captured Soviet codebooks from the early war period. Actual Soviet codebooks, recovered during combat operations or from evacuated Soviet facilities. These were priceless for understanding how Soviet encryption worked and for potentially cracking older messages that were still sitting in Allied files, unsolved. Operating procedures for Soviet radio networks, call signs, network structures, communication protocols. The kind of procedural information that seems mundane but is absolutely crucial for signals intelligence operations. Technical reports on Soviet cipher machines and their vulnerabilities, detailed analysis of Soviet encryption devices, including the teleprinter systems that the Germans called bandworm, and potential weaknesses in their design or operation. For the Allied codebreakers, this was like being handed years of research in an instant. All the trial and error, all the dead ends, all the gradual accumulation of knowledge that the Germans had gone through, it was all there, documented, ready to be absorbed. But the Schliersee documents were only part of the Tickham treasure trove. Remember those German prisoners that Howard Campagny had dug up from the ground at Rosenheim? Their equipment turned out to be even more immediately valuable than the documents. The Germans had built sophisticated demultiplexing receivers, devices specifically designed to intercept and separate Soviet radio teleprinter signals. Soviet military communications used a transmission technique called multiplexing, which combined 2 or more separate message streams into a single radio channel. Think of it like perfectly shuffling 2 decks of cards together. The transmitted signal was an interleaved mixture of bits from multiple messages. At the receiving end, a demultiplexer with a rotating distributor would automatically shunt each successive bit onto separate wires, each connected to its own printer, reconstructing the original separate message streams. It was sophisticated technology and the Soviets used it extensively. Some signals carried as many as 9 multiplexed messages at once. The encrypted military traffic that interested Allied intelligence used 2-channel multiplexing. The problem was that successfully intercepting multiplex signals was technically challenging. You needed the demultiplexer's rotating distributor to turn in exact synchronization with the incoming signal. Get the synchronization wrong even slightly and you just get gibberish, bits from different messages scrambled together in the wrong order. American and British engineers had been working on building their own demultiplexers, but it was a maddeningly difficult problem. The synchronization was touchy. The equipment was temperamental. And then the Germans just handed them the solution. The devices recovered at Rosenheim were called Hartmurfachfernschreiber, HMFS for short. Multiple teleprinter, in English, though that translation hardly captures the sophistication of the equipment. The HMFS was an extremely advanced piece of engineering. It had an oscilloscope that provided a visual indication of when the receiver was properly synchronized. An automatic circuit would then lock in the synchronization, maintaining it continuously. A short-term memory buffer using relays automatically converted the rapid incoming pulses of the radio signals to the longer pulses that teleprinter machines needed to operate. It was plug-and-play signals intelligence collection, decades ahead of its time. By June 29, 1945, the German prisoners had assembled one of their HMFS receivers at Steeple Clayton, near Bletchley. They inserted different distributors to demonstrate the device's versatility. It could handle anywhere from 2 to 9 multiplex channels. The next day they had 50 teleprinters hooked up, printing out streams of intercepted Russian signals. 2-channel encrypted military traffic. 9-channel unencrypted commercial and administrative messages. All of it flowing onto paper in real time. The British cryptanalysts watching this demonstration must have been amazed. In a single afternoon, the Germans had shown them how to solve a problem that had been frustrating Allied engineers for months. There was a minor hiccup a few days later when the British Post Office called to report that radio listeners in the area were complaining they couldn't pick up BBC broadcasts. Apparently, the HMFS equipment was generating considerable local radio interference. Worried that more inquiries might follow, and satisfied that the tests had been a complete success, Bletchley shut down the operation and sent some of the equipment to their intercept station at Knockleton, Kent. By the end of July 1945, 1 German 9-channel receiver and 2 2-channel receivers were on their way to Washington. The German prisoners stayed in England for 4 months of further interrogation, providing technical training to Allied personnel who would operate the equipment. The Tickham Hall had saved the Allies 6 to 9 months of development work. Maybe more. And in the intelligence world, where your enemy can change their systems overnight, 6 months is an eternity. The Tickham operation eventually recovered an astounding amount of material from across Germany. Beyond Schliersee and Rosenheim and Naumburg, other teams made additional discoveries. Mobile signals intelligence units were located and their equipment seized. Research facilities were identified and their personnel interviewed. Cryptanalysts were captured and interrogated. In total, Tickham recovered hundreds of tons of documents, dozens of pieces of sophisticated technical equipment, and interrogated hundreds of German signals intelligence personnel. Much of this material remained classified for decades. Some of it is still classified today. But we know enough to understand the scale of what was found. The Germans had been exceptionally successful at signals intelligence during the war. More successful than most historians realized until documents began to be declassified in the 1990s and 2000s. Against the Soviets in particular, German cryptanalysts had achieved penetrations that were both wide and deep. They'd read tactical military communications. They'd cracked some diplomatic traffic. They'd analyzed Soviet cipher machines and identified vulnerabilities. And now all of that knowledge, 6 years of intensive cryptanalysis conducted by some of the best minds in German military intelligence, was in Allied hands. But there was a moral dimension to Tickham that made everyone involved slightly uncomfortable. These German cryptanalysts weren't just sources of technical information. Many of them had been fighting against the Soviet Union for years. Some were terrified of falling into Soviet hands, knowing what would likely happen to them if they did. And suddenly, here were American and British officers treating them not as enemies but as valuable assets, offering them protection, interested in their expertise. In some cases, treating them with more respect than they'd received from their own officers. The regular army soldiers watching this unfold didn't always understand it. Why are we being nice to these Germans? Why are we protecting them from the Russians who were our allies? The cryptanalysts understood, though they couldn't explain it to anyone without security clearance. These German specialists possessed knowledge that would be crucial in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. Their cooperation was more valuable than their punishment. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout the early Cold War. German scientists and technicians, even some with compromised pasts, being quietly recruited by both the Americans and the Soviets, their expertise valued more than their wartime allegiances. Art Levinson, the Jewish kid from Brooklyn, found himself in an almost surreal situation as Tickham Team 1 escorted captured German equipment out of Germany. The German NCOs who'd operated the communications vehicles were driving their own trucks in the convoy. They'd proven cooperative and helpful, genuinely eager to assist. At one point, Levinson, tired from the journey, let one of his German prisoners carry his rifle for him. This led to a tense confrontation when they drove through Belgium. Belgian civilians, seeing obviously German trucks and an armed German soldier, thought the Nazis were back. An angry mob formed. It took considerable effort to explain the situation and calm things down. The moral ambiguities of the immediate post-war period were everywhere. Yesterday's enemies were becoming today's sources. The alliance that had won the war was fracturing. And intelligence officers were making pragmatic decisions about who to protect and who to cultivate as future assets. While Tickham teams were collecting German intelligence in Europe, The codebreakers at Arlington Hall in Virginia were grinding away at Soviet communications with agonizing slowness. The Soviet section at Arlington Hall was small, maybe 20 or 30 people at its peak, and their work was brutally difficult. They were trying to break what's called an enciphered code. First, Soviet communicators would encode their messages by replacing words and phrases with 4-digit number groups from a codebook. Then they would encipher those code groups by adding random numbers from one-time pads. The result was 2 layers of protection. Even if you could strip away the encipherment and recover the underlying code groups, you still had to figure out what those code groups meant. And without the codebook, that was nearly impossible. By early 1946, Arlington Hall's Russian section had made some progress. They'd recovered about 15,000 groups of additive key, the random numbers that had been added to encipher the messages. They'd identified around 2,000 possible code groups in what they called the Jade codebook, though half of those identifications were doubtful and only 20 had even tentative meanings assigned. They were adding maybe 10 new code groups per month. At that rate, it would take decades to read Soviet messages consistently. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. In January 1946, a linguist named Meredith Gardner joined the Russian section as its chief book breaker, the person responsible for figuring out what the code groups meant. Gardner was perfect for the job, though you wouldn't know it from looking at him. Shy, slender, self-effacing. The kind of scholar who'd learned Russian by taking lessons from a fellow student's Russian-born grandmother. He taught himself Bulgarian, Hebrew, and other languages just because he was interested in them. During the war, he'd worked on Japanese military attaché codes. Now he was turning his attention to Soviet communications. In his first 2 weeks, Gardner added 86 new entries to the Jade codebook, nearly doubling the number of known code groups. It was an astonishing burst of progress that left his colleagues shaking their heads in amazement. Then, on December 13, 1946, Gardner achieved something that would change everything. He broke the Jade codebook spell table from a 1944 message that contained a lengthy report in English. Remember what Frank Rowlett had learned from interviewing the Soviet defector Igor Gouzenko back in September 1945? Soviet codebooks included a special system, a code within the code, used to spell out foreign words or Russian words that didn't have their own code groups. A special code group indicated begin spell. Another group indicated the end of the spelled-out section. Within that section, the number groups stood for individual letters rather than words. Once you had the spell table, you could read those spelled-out sections. And spelled-out sections were vulnerable to basic cryptanalysis, frequency analysis, pattern recognition, the same techniques that had been cracking simple ciphers for centuries. Gardner had found the spell table. And that meant he could start reading Soviet messages, at least the parts that were spelled out. A week later, Gardner broke part of another 1944 message. This one also contained large stretches of spelled-out words. They were scientists' names, the message stated. Scientists working on the problem. Gardner worked through the spelled-out sections, one letter at a time. And the names that emerged from the cipher sent a chill through everyone who saw them. Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, Emilio Segre, Arthur Compton, Ernest Lawrence, Harold Urey. Every single one was a leading physicist working on the Manhattan Project, America's top-secret atomic bomb program. And this message was from 1944, when the very existence of the Manhattan Project was classified top secret. Gardner had just stumbled onto evidence of Soviet espionage against the atomic bomb program. The implications hit immediately. The Soviet diplomatic communications that Arlington Hall had been trying to break weren't routine diplomatic traffic at all. They weren't ambassadors sending policy reports to Moscow or consular officials handling visa applications. This was an intelligence channel. Messages from Soviet spies in the United States and Britain, reporting back to Moscow. Communications from NKGB, the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service, later to become the KGB, coordinating espionage operations against their wartime allies. The Americans had penetrated Soviet spy communications. Over the next several months, Gardner and his colleagues at Arlington Hall worked their way through more messages. They couldn't read everything. The Soviets had been careful, and many messages remained impenetrable. But they could read enough. What they found was shocking. Soviet intelligence had been running massive espionage operations against Britain, the United States, and Canada throughout the war. Agents in government departments, Sources in military facilities. Scientists working on the atomic bomb. Diplomats passing secrets. Officials providing classified information. The messages revealed code names: Quantum, Antenna, Liberal, Charles, dozens more. Matching those code names to real people would require additional investigation, but the overall picture was clear. The Soviets had achieved penetration of Western governments and scientific establishments that was far deeper than anyone had imagined. As Gardner decoded that atomic scientist message in December 1946, someone was standing over his shoulder, watching. His name was William Weisband, a linguistic advisor to the Russian section. Friendly guy, always moving around Arlington Hall, chatting with people, interested in everyone's work. Weisband spoke Russian fluently. He could read and speak Arabic. He spoke English with barely any accent. He'd served in the U.S. Army as a translator in North Africa and Italy during the war. He'd been working at Arlington Hall since 1945, cleared for access to the most sensitive cryptanalytic work. Gardner didn't think anything of it at the time, that Weisband was the first person outside the immediate team to learn that American codebreakers had penetrated Soviet espionage communications. Why would he? Weisband was one of them. Vetted, trusted, cleared for everything. Years later, not until 1950, the FBI would discover that William Weisband was himself a Soviet agent. A mole inside Arlington Hall, reporting to Soviet intelligence on American cryptanalytic successes. The moment Weisband learned about Gardner's breakthrough, he almost certainly reported it to his handlers. And Soviet intelligence reacted immediately. New codebooks were issued. New procedures were implemented. The cipher systems were changed. The brief window of vulnerability that Gardner had been exploiting slammed shut. Messages sent after 1946 were unreadable. The Americans could still work on the backlog. Messages from 1943 to 1945 that had been collected but not yet broken. But current Soviet communications were once again impenetrable. The damage was incalculable. Investigations that might have rolled up entire Soviet spy networks were stymied. Intelligence that might have been gained was lost. The cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall would spend years trying to reconstruct what they'd briefly achieved. All because a friendly colleague was actually working for the other side. The project to decrypt Soviet intelligence messages eventually received a code name: VENONA. Over the next several years, Gardner and his colleagues worked through the backlog of wartime messages. They couldn't read everything. Many messages remained unsolvable, but they could read enough to expose the scale of Soviet espionage. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who'd worked at Los Alamos and passed detailed information about atomic bomb design to the Soviets. His VENONA codename was Charles, or Rest, depending on which messages you read. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American communists who coordinated an espionage ring. Julius was Antenna, and later Liberal in the Soviet messages. They were executed in 1953 for atomic espionage, a decision that remains controversial to this day. Donald Maclean, a high-ranking British diplomat who was actually a Soviet agent, codename Homer. He would eventually flee to the Soviet Union in 1951 when British intelligence closed in. Kim Philby, a senior officer in British intelligence, the famous MI6, who was also working for the Soviets. One of the Cambridge 5 spy ring. The VENONA decrypts revealed codenames for hundreds of Soviet sources and agents. Some were identified through additional investigation. Many never were. The messages often contained only code names, and matching them to real people required other sources of information that didn't always exist. But the overall picture was devastating. Soviet intelligence had achieved penetration of Western governments, military establishments, and scientific programs that shocked even hardened intelligence professionals. For decades, almost nobody knew that the Schliersee discovery had happened. The Tickum operation remained highly classified until the 1990s. The documents seized from that Bavarian lake, the reports written by captured German cryptographers, the technical specifications for Soviet cipher systems. All of it stayed locked away in secure vaults at the National Security Agency. Even people who'd been involved in World War II cryptanalysis often didn't know about Tickum. The operation had been so compartmented, so restricted, that only those with a direct need to know had been briefed. The VENONA project remained secret even longer. The existence of decrypted Soviet intelligence messages wasn't revealed until 1995, when the NSA began releasing some of the material to the public. Even then, many details remained classified. Why such extreme secrecy? Partly to protect sources and methods. If the Soviets learned exactly how much the West knew about their cryptographic systems, they'd change everything. And even decades after the war, some of those systems might still be in use or might reveal principles that applied to current Soviet communications. But there was also political sensitivity. TICOM had involved extensive cooperation with former Nazi military intelligence personnel. German cryptographers who'd been reading Allied communications during the war were being protected, employed, even consulted by the Americans and British after the war. That wasn't the kind of thing Western governments wanted publicized while they were prosecuting Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg and presenting themselves as the moral victors of the war. And there were legal and diplomatic complications. The cable companies that had provided copies of all international telegrams to U.S. intelligence, a program that continued after the war, were operating in a legal gray area. The Federal Communications Act of 1934 made it a federal crime to divulge intercepted communications to third parties. The companies had cooperated because government officials assured them it was essential to national security and that the president himself had authorized the program. But nobody wanted to test those claims in court or in Congress. So the secret stayed secret. The boxes pulled from Schliersee remained classified. The German cryptographers who'd provided crucial intelligence were quietly resettled and their contributions forgotten, officially at least. The irony? There's a final irony to the Schliersee story. The German officers who sank those boxes in that alpine lake were trying to preserve their life's work. They couldn't bring themselves to destroy years of painstaking cryptanalysis, so they hid it, hoping perhaps to recover it later or use it as bargaining chips. They failed to keep their secrets hidden. American divers found them almost immediately. But in a sense, the Germans succeeded anyway. Their work did become valuable bargaining chips for the Allied governments that captured it. German cryptanalytic knowledge helped the West in its confrontation with the Soviet Union, which was exactly what many of those German intelligence officers would have wanted. The enemy of my enemy, as the saying goes, becomes my friend. Or at least my useful source. The boxes at the bottom of Schliersee were supposed to stay hidden until the chaos passed. Instead, they were found in the midst of the chaos and immediately put to use in a new war, the Cold War that would define the second half of the 20th century. Final thoughts. In 1985, at a reunion of World War II signals intelligence veterans in the United States, former German and Allied cryptanalysts met in peace. They shared stories, compared experiences, and reflected on the secret war they'd fought. One German veteran, asked about the TICOM operation and the Allied seizure of German cryptographic materials, smiled ruefully. "We spent 6 years learning how to break Soviet codes," he said. "And then we handed all that knowledge to you and you used it against them. I suppose that's not the worst outcome. Better you than the Russians themselves." Another veteran, British, raised his glass in a toast to the boxes at the bottom of the lake. "May they rest in peace in American archives." The room laughed. They all knew the story by then, declassified and discussed openly for the first time in 4 decades. The lake at Schliersee is still beautiful. Tourists still visit, hiking the mountains and sailing the clear waters. A small plaque near the shore commemorates the American soldier who drowned there in 1945, though it says nothing about the discovery his death led to. The boxes that emerged from those waters are long gone, dispersed to archives and research facilities. Their contents, 300,000 pages of German cryptographic intelligence, have been studied, analyzed, and mostly declassified. But for a brief moment in May 1945, those boxes represented the most valuable intelligence treasure in the world. 4 tons of secrets that nobody was supposed to find. Secrets that helped shape the Cold War and the secret battles that followed. All because an American soldier drowned, and divers went looking for him and found something far more significant than they were searching for. Sometimes history turns on the smallest accidents. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones you weren't trying to make. And sometimes, a lake refuses to keep the secrets entrusted to it. The Schliersee discovery was one piece of a larger operation, TICOM, that seized hundreds of tons of German cryptographic materials at the end of World War II. Those materials helped Allied cryptanalysts understand and eventually penetrate Soviet communications, exposing espionage operations and providing intelligence throughout the early Cold War. The story remained classified for 50 years, known only to a small group of intelligence professionals. Now, finally, we can tell the tale of the boxes at the bottom of the lake, and how they changed the secret war that shaped our modern world. If you found this story fascinating, you'll want to hear about the other Tickum discoveries, the castles full of codebooks, the German cryptographers who became Allied assets, and the beginning of the greatest intelligence agency the world has ever known. That story is coming next. Until then, remember, in the world of intelligence, nothing stays secret forever. Eventually, even the deepest waters give up their secrets.